Creepy dolls have gotten all the press over the years, and for good reason, but we don't recognize mannequins for being just as equally disturbing, if not outright frightening. Logically, dolls are much easier to fit into a horror movie scenario. People are much more likely to have dolls in their home than mannequins, because any person who brings a mannequin home is almost certain to be off their rocker. But mannequins are indeed creepy, with their blank faces and bodies that are like parodies of their human counterparts. We can probably thank the After Hours episode of The Twilight Zone for first using them to spooky effect. But really, no one in their right mind would want to be trapped in a room full of these odious plastic people. Well, if there's one movie that really does those creeps justice, it's Tourist Trap. Released in 1979, it was the directorial debut of David Schmoller, who based the film in part on his much-acclaimed 1976 short film, The Spider Will Kill You, which put him on Hollywood's radar. Producing was Charles Band, a few years into his career as one of the more notable low-budget horror movie producers in the business, and soon to be known for his own obsession with freaky dolls thanks to movies like the Schmoller-directed Puppet Master, Demonic Toys, and the appropriately titled Dolls. The man still has a killer doll fetish to this day. Not that we're ones to judge. But I digress. Tourist Trap opens with a humdinger of a scene. A lone dude, interesting that it's a guy in this scenario and not a buxom young lady, finds himself in an uninviting old house and besieged by flying objects while mercilessly mocked by a few very grotesque dummies. We're not quite sure just what the hell is going on here, and won't understand it for a while. But this opening signals that we're not in for just another routine slasher. This film was made immediately before the slasher boom of the early 80s, so thankfully it doesn't follow the paint-by-numbers formulas of so many Friday the 13th ripoffs. Not that Tourist Trap is wholly original. In fact, right off the bat, we're greeted with the most predictable situation in the genre book. The old car, broken down in the middle of nowhere bit. Conjuring up thoughts of Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the early sections of the film follow a quartet of attractive, if uninteresting, young adults as they look for help with their car trouble, as well as their missing compadre. That would be the unlucky fellow who's already worm food. Likeable in their own bland way, the foursome make the mistake of seeking assistance at a local tourist trap called Slauson's Lost Oasis, which looks like it hasn't seen a paying customer in 20 years. Slauson, its owner, is an affable old cowboy who seems for all the world like just the kind of guy you'd want to help you out. Don't they usually? From there, we get some familiar horror tropes. A host who displays some troubling sins of not being quite right. People wandering off into the dark when they clearly shouldn't. Many unseen things going bump in the night. And yes, lots and lots of creepy mannequins. But there's something unusually ghastly about these mannequins. They sing. Now, that may not sound scary, but ironically, it does sound scary whenever these soulless shells make quiet little murmurs. Sometimes they flat out open their jaws and belt out a weird little song. I can tell you that as a child, this was by far one of the creepiest sights I had ever seen. And wouldn't you guess, it keeps on happening throughout the entire picture. Mannequins are eerie as it is. I don't need them, showing off their angelic voices as well. Once in a while, they just scream. Not that that makes things any better. If that's not blood-curdling enough for you, there's also Davy. Davy is a troublesome masked figure who lurks around and, on occasion, does some pretty neat magic tricks like opening and shutting doors, breaking glasses, and even strangling women, all without touching them. Davy is Mr. Slauson's brother, the one responsible for all those hideous mannequins, but it doesn't take a genius to quickly realize perhaps Mr. Slauson is suffering from the same mental illness that plagued a certain mother's boy out of the Bates Motel. Sure, we'll spoil the obvious. Slauson and Davy are the same person. And while that doesn't come as much of a surprise, it still makes him a very effective villain. Davy is a menacing presence whenever he's on screen, whether or not we accept he's an entirely separate personality, or if Slauson is just so demented he likes to do the occasional costume change for when he goes killing. Given his hulking size and penchant for weird wigs, Davy understandably earns some comparisons to Leatherface. So much so that they apparently called him Plasterface on set. In any event, here's a very undervalued movie bad guy who really gets under the skin. The fact that he possesses telekinetic powers just makes him all the more formidable. Man, one can only imagine what he'd get accomplished if he put those powers to some real use. You've got to tip your hat to Chuck Connors, who goes all out with his performance as the wickedly unhinged Slauson. With a wholesome smile that can look vaguely sinister in the right light, Connors does anything but phone in his portrayal of this deeply weird individual. Connors was, and still is, best known for starring in the late 50s western The Rifleman, in which he played the ultimate good guy, Lucas McCain. But that character is a million miles away from Tourist Trap's resident psycho. Connors had an impressive career that spanned decades, but for horror fans, he's carved out a special place in their hearts with this masterfully creepy turn. Just hearing his voice as Davy is enough to make your skin crawl.
Sometimes I really don't know what I'm doing.
The rest of the cast is fine, unexceptional. 80s kids will dig on seeing Tanya Roberts in an early role, though her character is so uninspired you'll be lucky if you'll remember her name halfway through. The main standout would be Jocelyn Jones as the requisite final girl, Molly. Though a little slow on the uptake, considering she's Mr. Slauson's biggest fan until it's thoroughly obvious how nuts he is, Molly is a perfectly adequate heroine, played very well by Jones, who by the end definitely looks like she's gone a bit insane. The actress didn't have much of a career in the movies after this, which is a shame, because at the very least, she proves she can freak out with the best of them in the more intense moments. Perhaps the most shocking thing about Tourist Trap is that it was rated PG by the MPAA. While there's no overt gore or nudity in the movie, its dingy, perverse atmosphere absolutely lends itself to an R rating. You just feel kind of unclean while watching it. To be sure, PG movies got away with a lot more back in those days than they're allowed to now, but after it's over, you'd be hard-pressed to walk away from this one thinking you've just watched anything other than an R. That very well could be a testament to just how effectively unnerving and off-kilter some of the movie is. Incidentally, director David Schmoller was just as surprised as anyone when it received that PG, and even felt that the film would have done better if it had been tagged with an R. It's interesting to note that there was never a Tourist Trap sequel, and while your first reaction might be, how could there be considering the way the movie ends, let's remember the fact that seemingly dead villains have never stopped the movie business from making sequels. Maybe it's for the best, however, as it's often refreshing when a memorable horror movie is satisfied being a standalone picture. Though it's not as well known as several other late 70s, early 80s horror flicks, Tourist Trap certainly has its supporters. In his non-fiction book Danse Macabre, Stephen King praised the film's spooky atmosphere. And though it's never officially been remade, you don't have to look further than Warner Brothers' 2005 remake of House of Wax to see the DNA of Tourist Trap. Director Juan Colette Serra even admitted in an interview with Fangoria magazine that Tourist Trap was hugely influential on his film, and there's no arguing with that, with some of the newer movie's scenes clearly being directly inspired by Schmoller's. One such scene is so disturbing that it's hard to fathom it's in a PG-rated movie. The evil Davy methodically sets about torturing and murdering one of his victims, the previously unseen Tina, by telling her and us exactly how she's going to die. Said method would be suffocation, and the scene painfully makes us watch Tina's terror as Davy describes her imminently horrific death. It's nasty business, even if we've only just met this character. Not to be outdone, the House of Wax remake gave us a gnarly glimpse at poor Jared Padalecki getting prepped for a suffocation of his own, albeit a slightly more elaborate one. This is probably the best scene in that underrated movie, but it's still not as unsettling as the sequence in Tourist Trap. This movie looks just as it should, with Robert Burns doing an ace job making the interiors suitably dilapidated and ancient. This was the same art director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes, so the man knew how to make an environment look anything but hospitable. Plaudits are also necessary for composer Pino Donaggio, bringing his typical dramatic, over-the-top oral stylings to the project. Famous for his scores for movies like Don't Look Now and many of Brian De Palma's Hitchcockian thrillers, Donaggio's work here is appropriately surreal and engaging, giving the movie even more urgency than it already had. During its best scenes, Tourist Trap is like some kind of grody nightmare, and that's a compliment of the highest order. Naturally, what proves to be scary is always going to be subjective, and the fact that it's never been a household name is some evidence that it simply doesn't work for the majority of people. Heck, even the Riff Tracks guys spoofed it, and a good effect too. But for this writer, it boasts a compellingly ominous atmosphere, a very solid bad guy, and naturally, too many unholy mannequins to be comfortable with. If you're willing to go off the beaten path for a while, this is a tourist trap you'll likely be happy to have visited. If you make it out alive, of course.